everyone for joining us for another Learning Lunch co-hosted by Format Approved and eGestalt Technologies. Thank you for joining us today. Today's presentation is titled The HIPAA Security Risk Analysis, Pros and Cons of Self-Assessment Tools versus Expert HIPAA Guidance. Before we begin, some brief introductions. We're joined today by Anupam Sahai. Anupam is a co-founder and the president of eGestalt Technologies. He's a recognized expert in the areas of healthcare IT, cloud computing, security and compliance, and networking. Thank you for joining us today, Anupam.
My pleasure, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody.
It's always a pleasure to be able to share Anupam's expertise with our audience. I'm Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved. I have extensive experience with HIPAA and compliance training. Let's look at the questions we're going to cover in today's session while I go over some quick housekeeping notes so you can read those while I talk. Just remember that as we go through the presentation, you can ask questions of us at any time. Type those questions into the chat area. We generally hold those until the end of the session, and then we'll answer as many questions as time allows. If we do happen to run out of time and we haven't gotten to all the questions, we will provide written answers to those in our follow-up. Also, please note that all registered attendees of today's session will receive an email follow-up, as I was saying, with links to both the slides and the recorded versions of this event. So people always ask us if they can get the slides or if they can share this recording with some of their colleagues. Rest assured that we would be happy to share that with you, and you'll get it in a follow-up email. All right, so let's begin with our first question today, and I think I'll take this one to begin. So the first question is, why is the security risk analysis important? Well, for one thing, it's required by HIPAA, and in fact, it's the first requirement of the HIPAA security rule. So you could say this is like the very foundation of compliance with HIPAA. You have to do a security risk analysis to meet those requirements. Many providers also participate in the Meaningful Use program, and the government has, I think, cleverly sort of linked the two programs together. So one of the core requirements for participating in Meaningful Use is to meet the requirements of HIPAA around doing that risk analysis. So they're basically trying to capture all providers, all covered entities, as they're known under HIPAA, to be sure that they conduct the security risk analysis. But it's more than just complying with the law. It's more than just doing what the government says you have to do. It really is the foundation for having real security. So if you think about what can happen if things go wrong with compliance, there's, on the one hand, you can get fines from the government, but there's a lot more costs involved than just that. For each violation, you can have up to a $1.5 million fine from the government, but the average cost of a breach is more in the neighborhood of $5 to $6 million. And a lot of that comes from the liability that's involved. It seems like every large breach of data now leads to a class action lawsuit that's very costly. There's a huge hit to reputation. There's the costs of doing credit monitoring for people because health data is so valuable for identity theft. So if you think about it, what you're really doing here, on the one hand, you want to satisfy government regulations, but the ultimate goal is really to protect that data. Because if a breach happens, it's a disaster for everyone. And the risk analysis is absolutely key to protecting that data in ways that we're going to get to in our presentation today. Why is it key? Well, because it provides the map for identifying all of the security gaps and vulnerabilities that your organization has. And then it gives you detailed guidance on how you can remediate, which is kind of the industry term, but what that means is how you can fix those problems. So it covers all the things you need to do that, including what are your policies and procedures, do you have training in place, how are you protecting PHI. It's really comprehensive, and you've got to do one to be compliant. Anything you'd like to add to that, Anupam?
Yeah, I just want to re-emphasize the fact that this is a real problem today. And there are about 25 to 30 million identities that are stolen, that are breached every year. And roughly on an average, about 1 to 12 million identities are stolen per month. So these numbers are very real. The threat is very real, And what security risk analysis is trying to do is to estimate and minimize your risk exposure to the cyber attackers, which are now very sophisticated. They have very organized, they become very organized, and they have very sophisticated tools. And it could be a cyber attacker, or it could be a malicious insider. You want to be able to understand your risk exposure and minimize it for any external or internal threats.
That's a great point, and we've seen breaches in both directions. There's been, it's something people don't necessarily think about all the time, but there have been some large, very costly breaches that have involved, unfortunately, disgruntled employees, or sometimes employees who were just acting foolishly and didn't realize, that they weren't supposed to do what they were doing, although training should take care of that. But then there's also an increasing attack on providers from third parties, and the FBI just had a report on this that they circulated where they said that healthcare is now being attacked more and more. I believe a separate report from the Ponemon Institute said that attacks are up 100% since 2010. And yet healthcare lags badly behind other industry sectors in doing what they need to do to protect data. The unfortunate thing about that is that if you steal credit cards and sell those on the black market, apparently you can get about $1 for each stolen credit card. But health data is so valuable that it goes for more like $10 to $20. So I think there's increasing awareness, unfortunately, on the part of malicious actors that this is really valuable data to get your hands on, and unfortunately, it's relatively easy to get. This is something we were talking about just a moment ago, so let's just quickly re-emphasize this point, which is that the Meaningful Use program requires that you protect electronic health information, and the way that it requires you do this is essentially to do the security risk analysis that HIPAA requires. So you cannot attest for meaningful use without conducting that security risk analysis. We have 1514 on here because it's usually called core measure 15. Now they've renumbered the measure, so you could call it 14. But the point is, if you attest for meaningful use, if you've ever done it before, you know that this is one of the things you have to attest that you're doing. And unfortunately, a lot of people are getting in trouble with CMS for saying that they've done it when they haven't, or maybe having done one that's inadequate to meet the standards required by the government. So it's really an important part of meaningful use that people sometimes neglect. And the government their goal is to audit 10% of everyone who participates in meaningful use. So if you are participating in the meaningful use program, you really want to make sure you do this properly, or you could be at risk for not only giving the money back, but even stiffer penalties than that. And I know you've dealt with people who've had some of those difficulties in the past, Anupam, if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, we've had a number of cases, in fact, where medical businesses have taken the federal grant money for meaningful use attestation, and they have not, in actuality, performed the security risk analysis, and that's essentially not a good thing. And there have been some widely publicized cases in the media where the CIOs of the companies have been prosecuted, and in fact criminally prosecuted, where they might have to go to jail for falsely testifying to the government that they've done security risk analysis. So the government is taking this very seriously. The enforcement agencies are ensuring that if you've taken the meaningful use grant money, that you perform security risk analysis. And as Brian said, that they are randomly selecting about 10% of the businesses who've claimed the grant dollars to verify it. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that this needs to be repeated every year. So it's not good enough that you do risk analysis once and then you're done with it, because the law says that you need to repeat it every year, and within a year itself, if you want to make sure that your security posture or your risk posture is not changing, or is not putting you in a compromised position, you want to make sure that as things change, you are able to adjust and make changes to ensure that your risk exposure is minimal. So it's an ongoing process.
That's a great point, Anupam. You have to do it at least once a year. You have to do it at least once during that reporting period. If you change things, say you get a new EHR or something like that, you certainly have to do it again. So, you've got to not only do it, you've got to do it regularly, and you've got to do the remediation, which is another thing that people often leave out. So if that risk analysis finds, that you don't have proper access controls or something, to who can get access to the PHI, you've got to fix that before you attest. So if you don't do those things, you're definitely putting your meaningful use dollars at risk. All right, so I think we've emphasized the importance of the risk analysis. Anupam, I'd like you to address the steps that are required to do the risk analysis.
Sure. So let's describe and demystify what it takes to do security risk analysis. So at a very high level, what risk analysis is trying to do, it's trying to ascertain your security risk exposure to external malicious external cyber attackers, or probably for malicious or accidental disclosure by insiders. And there are three things that you're looking at. First thing is that you're trying to identify the critical assets that are in the business. So for a medical business, these critical assets are what are called PHI assets. So you're trying to ascertain any workstations, any servers, or any network devices that are either involved in PHI viewing, storing, or transmission of the PHI information. So the first step is to identify those critical strategic assets. The second step is to understand what are the different threats and vulnerabilities that these assets have. So the vulnerabilities could be in the form of outdated systems. There are patches that need to be installed. If there are malware sitting in these assets, there could be processes such as how things are shared, who gets to see the patient information. So there is a combination of processes and asset-related things that need to be put in place, need to be streamlined to ensure that you're able to understand the threats and vulnerabilities that can compromise these important critical assets. And the third step is then to mitigate the risk that was found. So it's not only important to understand the risk exposure, the risk gaps that exist, but once you know them, you have to take steps to mitigate the risk, to put together a remediation steps to plug the gaps that are found. And typically the various variables that you're looking at here include, as I said, critical assets, the threats and vulnerabilities that affect those critical assets. And assets could be, as I said, it could be IT assets, it could be people and processes as well. And then the impact and the likelihood in case these assets get compromised. And all of this together give you your risk posture, risk exposure level that needs to be fixed and remediated.
Well, let's get into more detail on what the steps actually are. I think you gave us a great overview of sort of the big picture. What are the real steps involved in making that determination?
Yeah, so let's take it to the next level. So first step is to identify the PHI assets. And these assets, as I said, could be IT assets, it could be people assets, it could be processes that are in place in the organization to protect the critical assets. All of these are in the purview of identification of the critical assets. Once you've identified the critical assets, we will then need to identify the threats and vulnerabilities that can be affecting these critical assets. And then what are the security controls that are in place today to prevent accidental or malicious misuse of these assets, of the PHI information. Now, if you have a firewall in your organization, that's a security control measure that you've taken. If you don't have a firewall, then anybody can come in and steal the data. But it's not sufficient to have a firewall. You need to ensure the firewall has the right policies, the right configuration, and the right security hardening capability to prevent external cyber attackers from breaking in. And not only that, all the data potentially needs to be encrypted. So there are a number of security controls that you are required to follow to ensure that these threats and vulnerabilities are not compromising the PHI critical assets. Once you know that, then the next thing is, if the assets do get compromised for whatever reason, what is the impact and the likelihood of that happening? So once you have step 1 to 6 known and ascertained, then the risk score tells you your current risk exposure level. It gives you a risk score that essentially tells you that either you're very prone to be broken in and compromised, or maybe you have enough security controls in place to ensure that your PHI critical assets are sturdy. They are not prone to being compromised, or there's a low chance of it being compromised. So once the risk determination is made, then the next step is to fix the gaps by putting together new security controls and document the process and communicating that to everybody involved so that they are aware of what are the do's and don'ts, the best practices, etc., etc. So this is a high-level view of the entire risk analysis process in terms of 9 steps that are needed.
And if you look at this, there's a lot of places where expertise comes into play. So for instance, to get the threat matrix right, you need to figure out what is the likelihood of a threat occurring, but then also if the threat, if that is realized, what is the impact of that then? So those are actually 2 separate axes that go into, determining what the overall risk is. And properly determining what those are does require a good bit of expertise, which feeds into sort of some of the subjects we're going to discuss a little bit later around why is it difficult to do this on your own, and what tools are available, and what are the drawbacks of using them. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's address, why does every HIPAA risk analysis require a compliance assessment? So what do we mean by the assessment? Basically, the assessment is a series of detailed questions about the organization's compliance. So there's more to a risk analysis than just the assessment. The assessment is an important part of it. Every risk analysis involves these questions, for instance, about where is your PHI? And in case anyone doesn't know, I should have thought of this earlier. When we're saying PHI, that's protected health information. Sometimes I think we assume everybody knows what that means, but the legal definition of that is, identifiable health information. That's health information that can be tied to a patient. So there's a series of questions around this. Where is your PHI? How is it accessed? How are there controls around it? Do you have termination procedures in place so that once someone leaves your organization, they can't continue to access it? It's a long, detailed list of questions, and that gathering that information is vital to performing the risk analysis, but it's not enough in itself to perform the risk analysis, which we'll discuss more in just a moment. But I think the important point here to make as well is that you can't fully automate a risk analysis. And so there's always going to be human aspects to conducting a risk analysis. There are parts of it that can be largely automated. There are certainly IT aspects of it that we'll touch on here more as we go. But a large part of it is gathering information from human beings, because the human beings are the only people who can address some of these questions. Would you like to add to that, Anupam?
No, I think you mentioned it, that this is where human intervention is needed to assess the people and the process-related critical assets, whether the right policies, the right people have the knowledge to manage the whole process. The IT asset part of it can be automated from a scanning perspective to understand which IT assets are prone to being compromised because they have inherent vulnerabilities, or maybe there's some malware that's sitting on there. So the IT asset scanning part can be automated, and that's a big piece of the whole puzzle. But there are other pieces that need human intervention, human judgment, to understand and to analyze whether the people plus processes related critical assets are in place, or they need to be upgraded so that they are not compromised.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes surprises people. The part of HIPAA that sort of sets rules for how you protect PHI is called the security rule. more than half of the requirements of the security rule are actually administrative. So those are not technical IT matters by and large. Those are things like, having proper policies and procedures, having training, that sort of thing. So assessing that definitely involves that human element, but there's also an important aspect that involves looking at that IT infrastructure because, if you have an open firewall, that's not really a human issue except for the fact that a human didn't take care of it properly. But, that's something that you can detect electronically and fix relatively easily. Unfortunately, that sort of gap has caused people a lot of problems and big fines. So this is something that I think is relatively new. It's kind of an exciting development in some ways. In other ways, there's certain risks associated with it. So let's talk for a minute about the tools that are available for self-assessment. And so there are a variety of tools out there. These are commercial off-the-shelf tools that you can just take and perform the assessment in some sense for yourself. And last month there was a big shift in this where HHS released a free tool that very small practices, is one thing that we need to be clear about, can download this tool, and it basically guides them through in an automated way a self-assessment that covers the HIPAA security rule only, so it doesn't cover the entire risk analysis. And when I say it guides them through, it basically presents questions that are taken from the NIST guidelines. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and HIPAA itself, because it's covering 700,000 odd covered entities and 2 to 3 million business associates, the law tends to be relatively general. It sort of sets goals and general requirements without getting really specific about how you go about meeting those requirements. Well, NIST then is where that gets cashed out, and the government goes ahead and provides more information about how you actually meet those requirements. So really what it does is it presents those NIST questions to the presenter or to the provider to answer, and then it does have some tools built in, like a nice glossary that you can look things up in. So that is sort of the nutshell of what the tool does from HHS, and there's other tools that are like that out there on the market. But as you can guess already from the presentation so far, there are drawbacks to doing it this way. There's a number of different drawbacks, but let's focus first on why the assessment itself can be a little bit difficult to get through for many providers. For one thing, there's always the possibility of technical difficulties. I've heard a number of stories from people who went to CMS and went to download went to HHS rather, and went to download the tool and had some difficulties getting it to work properly. Sometimes Internet Explorer seems to be treating it as a malicious file, although of course it actually isn't. And the downside of that, of course, is that there's no customer support here from the government. It's great that they've provided this tool to people for free, but if you do have technical difficulties with it, you're pretty much on your own. Certainly the government isn't going to help you with that. But a larger problem is that it uses a lot of specialized jargon that is really going to be alien, I think, to most providers. As I was saying before, these questions are based on the NIST guidelines. And the unfortunate part of that is that it's very much an insider sort of vocabulary. So it's going to ask you a lot of questions about, I used the example before of access controls, for example. If you don't know what those are, you can try to look them up in the glossary and try to figure out what they mean, but it's going to take you a lot of time unless you're already familiar with some of the security terminology. Another issue here is that, and this is probably the most important part of it all, is that it's asking you to evaluate things that I think are very difficult for most providers to evaluate. So it's asking you to use judgment about whether or not a requirement has been satisfied. And, unfortunately, providers are not security experts with very few exceptions. And so it's difficult for a provider to make a judgment call on a security question because they don't have the expertise to address that question. The other part of it then is that there's, and this is just human nature, a tendency if we're evaluating ourselves to sort of give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. So if I, I'm just thinking to myself, have I secured my home adequately? I'm probably going to decide that I have. I'm going to say, well, I fixed that window that wasn't working right. I put a new lock on the door. My home is secure. the unfortunate thing is that if a security expert were to walk through my home, there's a very good chance that they would come to different conclusions because there's, and again, it's just human nature. This is no criticism of anyone. There's just inevitably an element of complacency when you're evaluating yourself. You're saying, you know, I'm a good person, I did a good job, I put a lot of effort, and I think I've done good enough. Someone who's an expert, who's a third party, is bound to see the same situation more clearly. And the other thing is, they're not living with it every day. So they're going to identify things that you may not see yourself. So that's sort of a nutshell answer to it. I'd like you to add to that if you'd like, Anupam.
Yeah, so the key thing here is that HIPAA legalese that's coming from the HIPAA standard is really very cryptic and is subject to multiple interpretations, and it's ambiguous. And it's important that a domain expert who understands security, understands HIPAA, and understands IT is able to demystify the HIPAA standard and provide guidance on what needs to be done. If somebody who doesn't have these expertise or doesn't have the HIPAA background may or may not be able to interpret it correctly, and that could lead to either your HIPAA readiness not being complete and you not being able to meet the HIPAA audit protocol requirements, which basically is the requirement coming from HHS, where if basically they have a protocol to audit a number of things that they look for, and the tool and the implementation should meet those audit protocol requirements. So it's important that an expert is able to provide that detailed guidance with the help of a tool that meets those requirements, and that's really the key here.
So let's take a quick look at what the report is like as well, because that's one other complication here that people should keep in mind. So you go through this process. It is not a quick process, especially if you're not familiar with the terminology. If you're using the HHS tool, for example, you're going to have to go through and answer all of these questions, and in many cases you're going to have to research the terminology, as Anupam was just saying. So then out of it you get a report. Well, that's the other major drawback to this, I think, is that the report is very cryptic. And I've used the tool. I know Anupam's used it as well. The unfortunate thing is that when you get this report, you get something that looks like what you can see on your screen. So it'll tell you how you answered. It'll give you some sense of the risk level. But really what it does is it cites the regulatory citation. That gobbledygook code you see on your screen is citing the federal regulatory code that the question is supposed to satisfy. So there's no written summary of the results. It just sort of gives you this grid view of how you answered everything. And so you really are kind of at a loss then when you get these results for what you're supposed to do with it. So you can see how you answered the questions. It's, you can see that you haven't met some requirement that needs to be met. But in terms of having a narrative sense of where you're at in your compliance, you're not going to get anything like that. And ultimately, the most important thing is the risk analysis is not there just to, put in a box and say that you've done it. The whole point of it is that it's a map to fixing what it finds. So if you're not meeting a government requirement, if you're not meeting something you need to do to protect patient data, the whole point of it is to fix that thing. And that is probably the biggest drawback of the whole thing, is that when you get out of this, you really have no idea what you need to do to fix the problems that may have been exposed by the assessment. There's other drawbacks to it as well that we'll get to in a minute, but I think these are sort of the central, just related to the assessment, is that there's really no results that you can interpret in a way that makes sense. Anything you'd like to add to that, Anupam?
No, I think the next slide talks about what the limitations are.
Well, let's look at some of those other limitations, and if you could address this, Anupam, I think this will really give us a full picture of why it's not a risk analysis in itself.
Yeah, so the number of things that are missing from the HHS tool or some of the free tools that are available out there, firstly, it doesn't do network scanning. As I mentioned earlier, for all the IT assets, it's important to scan them for vulnerabilities. And what really the scanning process is doing is trying to emulate a hacker. A hacker could be an external hacker or a malicious or an unintentional insider. And so the scanning is trying to simulate a hacker and trying to break in and who's trying to compromise all the different IT assets. So without having a vulnerability map for all the IT assets, you have no way of knowing which of these IT assets are prone to being compromised. So it's missing that. It's also not a complete HIPAA compliance tool. It's looking at a subset of the HIPAA requirements, which is on the security rule only. And on the security rule, it does not give you the complete guidance with respect to what needs to be done. And so it's incomplete from a HIPAA perspective. It's incomplete in terms of a meaningful use report because it's not giving you a report that you can take and include the network scanning related issues that I mentioned. So it's basically giving you information about what needs to be done for following the security rule, which is part of HIPAA. And it's a good informational tool if you want to know what needs to be done. But if you want to pursue and get meaningful use dollars or HIPAA compliance, if you want to become HIPAA compliant, then you need another tool to get you there. It also doesn't include any continuous monitoring, which is really the case where you might be compliant today, but as things change, as there are new devices, as there are new employees that are coming in, or employees that are leaving the company, you want to make sure that your risk analysis and your security scanning process is repeated to ensure that all your critical assets, people, processes, and IT assets are robust and not prone to be compromised. So all of these are limitations of the tools that are available out there, and of course it doesn't support multiple users, multiple locations, so it's really applicable for very small single location practices who are looking to find a way to understand what is that they need to do. How they do it is beyond the scope of this tool.
Yeah, and I really should have mentioned that more fully in an earlier slide, so let's just emphasize that point. This tool is designed for really only the very smallest practices. And I think what the government is trying to do here, I think it's very well intentioned, is that unfortunately, if you look at the smallest practices, they tend to be the farthest behind on making sure that they're meeting their HIPAA obligations. For the most part, the big hospitals, not that they, the big hospitals certainly have problems, many of them suffer breaches, but they have more developed compliance programs. They've been sort of at this for longer. And although many small practices do a great job of meeting their HIPAA obligations, there's a lot of them that are still trying to catch up. So I think the government is trying to help them get resources. And in some ways, this tool, if nothing else, it'll give you a good sense of the fact that you need to do more to be compliant. So I think the government is trying to reach out to those very small practices and help them as much as they can. The difficulty is that it's not enough to get them to where they need to be. So Anupam, if you could address this question as well, how is an expert-guided risk analysis different? You've talked about some of the things that are different in terms of what a real risk analysis covers, but how can an expert make all the difference in this process?
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, that HIPAA has a lot of ambiguities and multiple interpretations that are possible, and there is a real need for an expert in HIPAA security and risk analysis to take those requirements coming from HIPAA and be able to interpret that and provide a completeness of process requirements to meet all the HIPAA requirements. And that includes the HHS audit protocol that I was talking about earlier. So if you go to HHS, they have published an audit protocol, which is really a set of things, requirements that they have presented and published, that if HHS does an audit, these are the 10 things that they would look for. And risk analysis is certainly one of the key requirements there. So when you're doing risk analysis, when you're doing HIPAA compliance, it's important to keep that audit protocol requirement in mind. And then the expert can help you interpret and translate some of the jargons that are used in the HIPAA compliance process. There are a number of cryptic terms like access control, like PHI that we talked about, two-faced authentication, and there are lots of terms like that that really requires expertise, and somebody who's living and breathing these different domains can really guide you there. So that's really the main case for having somebody who understands the space be able to guide you along with the tool that helps address all the requirements from a completeness point of view to ensure that you have addressed the security risk analysis issue.
And of course, the report that comes out of that process is considerably different. I'll sort of address this to begin, and then Anupam, you can add if I miss any important points here. But so if you're looking at the report that comes out of the process, for one thing, it meets all of the requirements, as Anupam has been saying. So you're not just getting kind of an assessment of the security rule. You're covering everything that you need to do. Then you have that expert judgment that we've been talking about throughout. So the expert is going to review that with his expert eye and be sure that it actually covers everything that needs to be covered. And then there's just sort of the accessibility aspect of it. So a report generated by an expert is going to include kind of a narrative account of where things are and what you need to do to comply. So there's not going to be all of this jargon and just reference to security regulations. Although a good report should include those things, you need to be able to know what the regulatory frameworks are that you're addressing, but you need more than that. You need to be able to understand what the results actually mean. And of course, an important part of that is you should be able to talk to the expert about the report. So, you know, this automated tool that we've talked about, some from HHS, for all the fact that it's useful, there's no human being involved except for the provider doing the self-assessment. Whereas if you're working with an expert, you should be able to talk to that person about the results because you're inevitably going to have questions about it, even if it's a very clearly written report. So that report should also provide you with detailed guidance on what you need to do to fix the problems found. Now, in some cases, what you need to do to fix a problem is relatively easy. For instance, if you haven't conducted HIPAA training, you need to do so. But even in cases where the answer is relatively straightforward like that, an expert will often be able then to suggest how you do that. You know, go to this site, purchase training, it's affordable, go do it. So you can get answers to your questions and get kind of ready-made solutions so that you can address these problems in an efficient way instead of just trying to cast about and reinvent the wheel to figure out how you should address them yourself. Anupam, would you like to add to that account there?
Nope, I think we can go to the next slide.
All right, let's go ahead then. Now you talked before, Anupam, about, you know, that the self-assessment doesn't include a network scanning, and that's an important part of it. But there's a lot more that tools that are built by experts can bring to the table as well. Please address some of the other things that you can get out of a tool built by experts.
Yeah, so some of the key things that we talked about earlier about being able to view your risk and compliance posture in real time through a dashboard. That's a critical part of knowing where do you stand today in terms of risk exposure. And if things change, the dashboard should reflect that. Then there needs to be a detailed knowledge base for providing detailed guidance on all the HIPAA and IT-related requirements. When a question is being asked about HIPAA, there should be information about, you know, what does it mean, and what are the best practices in the industry that people typically do to answer those questions. And there should be detailed policy guidance with respect to what are the set of policies excuse me, that need to be put in place. If the organization already has certain policies, one can validate whether they are correct or incomplete. And the guidance should be there from the tool perspective to help you from a policy perspective, from a training perspective, and then giving you complete guidance on what the gaps are today and how to fix the problems really is very key. So all of this together is really supplementing and working with the experts to to give you a complete solution that deals with your not only assessing your current compliance and risk posture, but being able to monitor it as things change. You should be able to look at it and view your real-time status so that you can take corrective action as things change.
Now that is a critical point. You can see this chart here on your screen that sort of gives you an overview of what it means to have continuous monitoring to understand how your threat environment is changing over time. I'd like you to walk us through this, if you would, Anupam, so we can understand sort of what's entailed in this chart.
Yeah, so this is the workflow automation from a risk and compliance management tool called Agify. And what it is doing is really to automate the whole process of not only assessing, but maintaining and continuously monitoring your security and compliance posture. So traditionally, you would start out by doing a baseline where you're trying to assess your current HIPAA compliance posture, your HIPAA risk posture, and this will result in a set of gaps that tell you what are the things that you're missing today. And once you know the gaps, then you essentially need to work towards putting together a remediation plan, which tells you that you need to do 10 things. One of those could be training. Other things could be that you need to put together new policy documents, new contracts. It will also tell you which IT assets need patching and upgrading, etc. So once you do the remediation and you've plugged all the gaps, then you go back and do a reassessment to ensure that all those gap exposure, the risk exposure has been mitigated, have been taken care of. And so that completes one cycle of this assessment process. Now, as I said earlier, it's not only important that you do the assessment and fix the problems that are found, but you want to be able to monitor this whole cycle and repeat this cycle on a frequent basis so that as things change, as new employees come in, as new assets come in, as new desktops or mobile handsets or laptops are brought in, that you repeat the cycle to ensure that your security and compliance posture is not compromised. So this tool automates the whole process of not only assessing but also remediating and monitoring your security and compliance posture. And at any point in time, you have access to a real-time dashboard that gives you your current risk levels and compliance level. And then you can take output in the form of reports, which can be meaningful use reports that you can submit to the government for getting the federal grant dollars. It's a complete automation tool. It meets all the requirements of HIPAA and security risk analysis and will help you pass the HHS audit protocol requirements as well.
So you see, this is on a whole nother level than going through kind of a self-assessment tool. But it also, just as this is a circle, this process on the screen, it brings us full circle because it comes back to the whole point of doing this. Yes, there are things you can do to sort of check the box and meet the government requirements, but that's not the point of this, and that's not really the risk. The risk is that you will have a breach of data, and that then not only will you have the damage to your reputation, you'll have fines from the government, you'll have liability concerns, you'll have all of those. It's a nightmare. No one wants to go through that. And if you really want to protect yourself from that, it's not enough to get a risk analysis and then just sort of walk away and be done with it, even if you do the remediation. Because unfortunately, things change constantly in any medical environment. So you've got new people bringing new devices in, you've got all sorts of things that can change, new employees, employees leaving, and you need continuous monitoring to actually have continuous protection. And that is the real point of all of this. So if you've got that continuous monitoring, you can rest assured, you can feel secure in your own environment that that data that you're safeguarded with, that patient data, is actually protected day to day. And that's the real goal of all of this. So here, our last question before we get to questions from our audience is, are there free tools available that were built by experts? And so we're happy to be able to offer this through this webinar to give people a chance to sort of try out the tool that Anupam was just talking about. To try out that tool, you can go to www.formedfreescan.com, and you'll be able to download a tool that gives you an idea of what an expert tool looks like. So that tool will conduct a partial network scan. It will guide you through some of the self-assessment questions, and it'll let you get a look at what the dashboard looks like and how the whole thing works. So it's very easy to use. It's really very simple to download that network scanning tool. It's all done remotely as well, which is another advantage of this. I think there has been for a long time in healthcare kind of a model of either sending people off to boot camps for every little thing or bringing consultants in for every little thing. And to be honest, as a company that's deeply involved in health IT, that's kind of an outmoded approach to things. It's unnecessarily expensive to do things that way. It's also very inconvenient. So one of the great advantages of this tool is that you can do all of it remotely and really get a good sense for what your compliance risks are just from this free tool. Then, for instance, if that network scan shows that you've got major gaps that you need to address, then you can look at the possibility of going with a paid service to sort of address some of that. So it's really exciting that this tool is available for free. And so that's an opportunity that anyone who has questions about their own compliance environment, I would certainly encourage you to give it a shot. And while I'd ask Anupam to add anything here in a moment, if I left anything out there, I thought I'd let you look at the contact information for us. We are happy to do these presentations. eGestalt and Formed approved. We do regular education on HIPAA. Obviously, we provide services out to medical providers that are paid services, but we provide lots of free information because we really are deeply committed to trying to improve security compliance for healthcare providers. So if you have any questions, do feel free to call us or send us an email. We're always happy to answer questions for people. I get questions all the time, just random HIPAA questions from people that I've never heard of before, and I'm always happy to answer those to the best of my ability, and I know Anupam feels the same way. So do feel free to contact us. Anything you'd like to add to our presentation before we get to questions from the audience, Anupam?
No, I think let's take the questions if there are any. And
all right, well, let's get to that then. I've got a couple questions we can address before I discuss some of these other resources here on your screen. Remember that you're going to get a follow-up email from us that will have the slides and the video recording of this along with some other resources and opportunities for you. If you do have questions for us, go ahead and type those in. We've got a couple now, but we probably have time for a couple more, and if not, we will certainly address those in the follow-up. So let's get to our first question from the audience. This question is the meaningful use security risk analysis different than the HIPAA risk analysis? Anupam, maybe you could address that one.
Yeah, so meaningful use risk analysis and the HIPAA risk analysis is really the same thing. The security rule in HIPAA essentially states that you need to do security risk analysis, and the meaningful use attestation is essentially re-emphasizing the same thing. So the security risk analysis that is needed for meaningful use attestation is the same thing from a requirements perspective.
But if you get into it as well, one other thing to think about is that, just to add to that, is people sometimes think of all PHI as electronic PHI, but if you think back to when HIPAA was passed, it was 1996, at that time very few providers had EHRs. And so almost all PHI at that point, some larger hospitals certainly had EHRs by then, but generally PHI was paper records. So meaningful use, obviously, that only concerns electronic health records. So I guess one way to think about the difference is it's the same set of requirements, but the reason why HIPAA compliance is so important to meaningful use is that when you take those paper records and move them into a digital system, the security risks multiply. So, no one can really break into an office. Certainly someone could break in and take some records, okay? But no one can who's based in, say, Asia somewhere, can come into an office in Indiana and run off with paper records, but they can easily do the same thing with electronic records. So that sort of explains the rationale for why they linked meaningful use to HIPAA. And really, when you're looking at that meaningful use risk analysis, you're really trying to figure out how or you're doing a professional evaluation, I should say, of how the PHI is housed in that EHR. So it just really exposes that data to a lot more risks, and so the stakes for making sure you get it right go up. Let's address another question from our audience. I think this is something that is addressing something you said before, which is, Anupam, that the self-assessment covers only the security rule. What else needs to be covered?
Yeah, so HIPAA comprises of many other categories of requirements. So certainly there is a security rule, there is the privacy rule, then there is the EHR related requirements, and there are a number of administrative requirements. So there are about roughly 260 plus citations or requirements that come from HIPAA, and there are about 160 plus questions that need to be addressed. While security rule is certainly a big part of it, but it's not completely the overall, it's not complete in terms of meeting the overall HIPAA requirements. So a complete tool will need to address all the requirements coming from all categories of HIPAA, including security.
All right, well, let's go over some of the free resources we have. First of all, if you'd like to ask us questions again, remember we're going to send an email out that'll have the slides from this session and the video recording, so you'll see our contact information again, which is on this slide. So if you didn't jot that down, please feel free to do it now, but you'll get the slides and you can just click on the link and email us if you'd like. To learn more about our companies, you can visit the links on your screen there. Go to www.egestalt.com to learn more about eGestalt. You can click on www.formatapproved.com to learn more about us. There's a lot of free resources on both of those sites. And to access that free tool, you can actually go to either site, but if you just want to go to www.formedfreescan, we've set up an easy access for you to get to that free tool, so do take advantage of that. If you know that you need to buy something like a risk analysis, if you want that expert guidance, go to www.formedservices.com. That's the second link on your screen there. We've got very cost-competitive prices. You can look at what's included in the various products, and so you can really get a good picture of what's available by going to that link. And of course, you should always feel free to contact us. You can visit formatapproved.com to learn more about our upcoming Learning Lunches, or you can click on the Learning Lunch button there. Then the Learning Lunch button will take you to our upcoming webinars where you can learn more and register. Our next Learning Lunch will air May 13th and has the title, A Prescription for Patient Payments to Reduce Receivables. So before we conclude, I'd like to thank you for joining us, Anupam. It's always a pleasure to be able to share your expertise with our audience.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you all for coming. Have a great day.
All right, well, thank you again to our audience. Do feel free to reach out to us with any questions you may have. And otherwise, just keep an eye on your email box and our homepage for our upcoming topics and free resources. Thank you again for joining us today.